Hello class, I would like to talk about assignment number 8 and practice number 9. So let's get started. But first, I want to kind of go over some things I've seen in your assignments. And I just want to cover a couple of things. The first one is numbers don't need to be converted. So I see like numbers equal to int 1. That's not needed here. All you need is number 1 is equal to 1, right? That's all you need. That will work. And then along those lines, and we'll see it again here in a few minutes as well, is in this example here, x is set to 5, and we're doing a logical comparison here. But then in the code here, we have x. We're converting x into an integer again. I don't know why we're doing this or why you think you have to do this, but this code could be x is equal to x minus 1 or x is minus equals 1. All three lines here are the exact same thing, but where this is probably not the right way to do it. And then I'll talk about why we use int, but not in this case in a few minutes. While loops. I saw this while loop in the assignments. It's awfully big. This could easily be simplified to, and we'll see this in when I go over the actual assignment. So number 1, we could say is greater than 0, or number 2 is greater than 0. This would be a lot shorter logic statement than this big one up here. Although the big one does work, it's just kind of confusing. But I just want to point that out that, it shouldn't be that long. Back to number converting again. So this is the right way to use the int or float or whatever version to convert that number that you get from input. Now, if you remember, input returns a string. So even though you enter a 5, the number 5, when you use input, it returns it as a string, not a number value. And that's why we use int here. So another way you can think about this, number 1 is equal to int 5. Okay, so input this. So first number, this is going to prompt the user, right? It's going to put on the console line first number colon, and then it's going to wait. And then on my keyboard, I hit 5 and I hit enter. So this will return a string with the letter 5 in it. And so we use int or float, whatever one we need to convert from, to convert this string to an actual number. So that's why we use int. Now, again, in this code that I swiped from one of your projects, this number has already been converted to an integer. So in reality, this is what we have right now. So number is equal to 5. But here we're converting that number 1 again from an integer to an integer, which doesn't make sense. And then again, we have the 1, right? So this, I'll separate the two. Number 1 can equal number 1 times 1. That's the same thing. Or we can shorten it even more and say number 1 times equals 1. So again, all three statements are all technically correct, all technically the same thing. Line number 1 is just extra stuff you need to do, and thus make your program a little slower. You won't notice it in your programs, but if this was like a big production thing, this would be a big red flag that tells me that this is going to run slower than these two statements. And these two statements run about the same speed, so it doesn't matter which one you use. I've noticed this in a couple assignments where I think people are not quite understanding how logic statement works. So let's say first number and second number are actual number values. This and statement is not going to work right in this statement. Also, is not a valid logic statement in this case. So it was actually flagging this. When I ran the code, it would flag it and say, hey, this was an issue. What this should have been was something along the lines of first, use the same formatting, first number not equals 0, and second number not equals 0. So that would be the equivalent or the correct way of putting this. So again, when you have this Boolean logic statement and, or if you use or, if you had or here, depending on what your needs are, that needs a Boolean value on either side of it. Okay, so with first number being a number, it's not really a Boolean value. So here you have a number, and it's going to treat it as a Boolean value. And so in that case, if number is 0, it represents false. And if first number is not 0, it's going to evaluate to true. And so if we're going forward, right, you should have a Boolean value on each end of your or statements or your and statements. So this will evaluate to a true or false statement. This will evaluate to a true and false statement. And then the or is going to take those two true and false statements and produce another true and false statement based off of those values and what or does. Another thing I noticed in some code is people will put a continue at the end of the while loop. That's not needed. You only need to continue if you had logic at the beginning of a while loop or any loop, and you want to skip the rest of the loop and you just want to continue, right? So for a lot of the programs that we're doing right now, we don't necessarily need to use the continue or the break statement. But if the way you're coding it up, you need the continue or the break statement, that's perfectly fine as well. I'm just saying we kind of don't need those right now, but it's great that you guys are using them and understanding. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about, before I start getting to the assignments, is the print statement. I see everybody's using different kind of print statements. So I just want to kind of point out another way of doing it. I think I mentioned this, but I'm going to mention it again. So anytime you have a string, so that's with a double quotes, if you put a lowercase f in front of that string, it tells Python that this string has some formatting in it. And so if you use curly braces, it's going to evaluate whatever is in between those curly braces. So it's going to take the R value, whatever that was. Again, I swiped this from somebody's code, and it's going to add 1 to it. before it does the printout. So like I could do print. I could use it with print. I could do F, and then I could say hello, and I could put curly brace, and I could put scores in there, for example. And so now it's going to take this value and then put scores exactly into this spot. So say scores was 85. We would see this on the I said 85, right? We'd see this on the console. It would print that out if scores was 85. And again, you could put some, you could do ×2, you could do whatever in there to -2, whatever, right? It will evaluate that. So say scores was 87 now, to keep my comment the same. If scores was 87 and it got up to here, it would do scores -2, which would make it 85, and then it would print out hello 85. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, now to the practice stuff. Okay. So for the assignment number 8, or multiplication calculator. Yeah. For this assignment, you were to write a program that accepts 2 numbers as inputs and shows the results of multiplying those 2 numbers. It should continue until the user enters 0 for both terms. So the key term here is it continues until we get to 0 values. In addition to passing all tests, your program must include comments and use both good variable names to receive full credit. I haven't really seen any big issue with variable names so far, so you guys are pretty good about that. So that's the general idea of what we're trying to do here. We're taking 2 numbers, we're multiplying them, we're showing the values, and then we keep on going until we get 2 zeros. Input, your program should accept 2 integers as inputs. Output, your program should output a brief greeting message, the results of the multiplication problem, and a final goodbye message once the program is complete. See below for sample output. And so looking at this, you should have deduced that, there's a greeting message at the beginning, and then there's this goodbye at the end. And so if we look at the example here, we have this example of inputs, or this greeting message, and then we have the values that are turned in, and then we have the goodbye at the very end. So based off of this comment here and the example down here, we have this greeting message. So first thing I did was I made that greeting message. I said print and blah, 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 print, blah, blah, blah. And I just copied what was in the sample execution. It didn't have to match, but you probably needed something at the beginning. And then at the end, you needed a goodbye. So I put the goodbye in. Those are the first 2 things I did, was these 2 print statements. And I got those complete and done, right? It was very simple. And now I got to work with this loop. So I know I need 2 numbers, right? So I make number 1, number 2. I set them to default to 1. And I didn't do the int thing because I don't need to, because it's already an integer. And then I make my while loop. And so I make sure that number 1 is greater than 0, or that number 2 is greater than 0. So I just need one of those numbers to be greater than 0. So if they're both less than 0, so I could put -1 in here. Which we didn't talk about in the example about using negative numbers. We just use all positive. So So that's an issue, right? You could have programmed for. But anyways, I have my two numbers here. I'm gonna ask the user for the first number. I'm gonna ask the user for the second number. I'm going to convert those to integers. And then if those numbers are, again, this is my while loop statement up here. If both numbers are 0, it's not going to do this, and it's going to break out of the while loop. If one number is greater than 0, it's going to do this output. So if I play this, right? So here's my greeting message. And then if I put in 5 and 4, I get an answer, and it's correct. And I can put 4 and 5. I can do 5 and 0. I can do 0 and 4. And I can do 0 and 0. And so when I do 0 and 0, it says goodbye. Now these numbers are the exact numbers I use to grade your guys' project, so you get an idea. One thing I noticed as I was doing this is in the output, there was a space between each of the sets. I'm really not going to care about that. This was fine. A lot of people did this. Also compacts it. The other thing I did test as well was I made sure that if I did 0, 0, it worked as I hope it would work, right? So to say goodbye. So when I come here, number 1 and number 2 are zeros. It doesn't meet that criteria of one of these numbers being bigger than 0, and so it just puts them out there. Okay, so that is problem number 8. So let's go to problem number 9. So this is practice. So we're continuing with loops. And so we want to write a program that will ask for 5 test scores and print the average score. Only use one input statement. Okay. So input is just 5 test scores. Output is the test score average. And so this was the sample execution. And so if we go to that problem, you can see, put my comments in. Everybody's doing great with that. I know I need a counter. I know I need to sum up my values, my scores. And so I just make a while loop that counts, or that checks to make sure that the count is less than 6. Then I get my value. I do float this time. Integer was fine as well if you guys use integers, but there could be you could argue that some grades are float values. But in the example execution, they're all integers. So either way would have been fine. So we do input. We have a formatted string here. So I'm asking for test score number. And I put count in there. So count starts at 1. So we'll get 1. When I get that value, I do the sum. So I add the sum to it. And then I increment the counter. And then once I do my 5, this while statement will be done. So count will be 6 at that point. And 6 is not less than 6. So it terminates the while loop. I calculate the average, which is just the sum divided by 5. And then I print out my statement. The average score is the average. So if I run this, it's going to ask for the first score. So I could put in 80. I could put in 50. I can put 56.32. And so there is my average. Okay. So this looks pretty close to this. It behaves pretty close to this. So again, the goal of this project or this practice assignment was to use while loops. And we had the statement of only using one input statement. And so I only have the one input statement. And so if you used multiple input statements, you got dinged pretty hard for that. Yeah, so that's it. Please reach out to me if you have any questions or need help with anything. And that should be it. Okay, talk to you guys later. Bye.